This is the fourth in our series of daily devotionals on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and today focusing on the work of Nehemiah. You'll remember from the previous devotionals in this series that the work of Israel's three great leaders, Zerubbabel, Ezra and Nehemiah, all seem to follow a pattern of sorts. Their work is each commanded by a Persian king. Each one works diligently at their task, eventually overcoming opposition and resistance until the job is done. But in each case, there's a slightly disappointing conclusion. The very moment when we might have anticipated that God's blessings would shower down from heaven, heralding the immediate fulfillment of all that the prophets had promised. Well, we expect that, but it doesn't happen. And just as with Zerubbabel's building and rebuilding of the temple and Ezra's project of re-establishing proper temple worship and the teaching of the law, well, so also with Nehemiah's great wall building project. The decree is made, the work is begun, resistance is defeated, and the job is done. But then something is not right. There is a huge gap between the expected outcomes and the reality. Now, when we meet Nehemiah, he is the trusted cupbearer and food taster to King Artaxerxes in Susa. The king gives him leave to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem and provides some support to get the job done. And in the very personal series of journal notes that make up the book of Nehemiah, we see a man of great leadership and skill and courage. He's most impressive. And that's why I suppose that the book of Nehemiah often gets trotted out for use to teach leadership or to launch a building program for the local church. No doubt Nehemiah is a great example of a leader from which we could learn a lot. But I don't think that that is at all the purpose of this book. Nehemiah travels to Jerusalem and he sets to work immediately. And no sooner has he gained the support and the commitment of those already in Jerusalem to actually start building the wall, no sooner than opposition arises in the form of Sanballat and Tobiah, leaders of the neighbouring Samaritans. The Samaritans again, yes. But under Nehemiah's expert guidance and careful planning, work does begin, and so he writes in Nehemiah 4 verse 6, "So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart." But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Opposition grew, but the work continued with prayer, sweat, and vigilance. Chapter 4, verse 16. "From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armour. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked." And while the work was progressing, with all the community helping, the economy was crashing in the midst of a famine. The families doing the work on the walls were complaining that they were unable to get food. Others had to mortgage their fields and their homes, or even sell their children into slavery in order just to get grain to eat. Still others had to borrow money to pay their taxes to the king back in Persia. So Nehemiah writes in chapter 5, "When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind, and then I accused the nobles and officials. I told them, 'You are charging your own people interest.' So I called together a large meeting to deal with them, and I said, as far as possible, we have brought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So for Nehemiah, opposition came in many forms, from the Samaritans and from within. And yet, Nehemiah records that the rebuilding work was completed in 52 days. It was a superbly planned and executed surprise project that brought protection and status to Jerusalem, to the temple, and to her people. And so in chapter 6, Nehemiah records, when all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Also, in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was a son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Arah, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. Perhaps you can already see the problems that are being baked into the pudding, which was the walled city of Jerusalem. Despite the wall, Tobiah the Samaritan's influence remains. His insidious undermining of Nehemiah hasn't been eradicated at all, despite the fact that the walls have been built and the gates put in place. When Nehemiah's work was complete, there was a great celebration, and then there was a solemn assembly. The law of Moses was read and explained and understood, and initially the people worked hard at obeying it in every detail. But soon there was creeping compromise, subtle at first, but sin was tolerated. We've already noted Tobiah's influence, but then when Nehemiah returns to Susa, as he promised King Artaxerxes he would, Tobiah does a deal with some of the priests. Apparently, he needs a little bit of extra storage for all his stuff, and so he pays the priests to use part of the temple as a kind of Kennard storage. Another one of our creeping concerns, I suppose, about the new state of affairs in Jerusalem relates to the dynamics of a city that is built on an agrarian economy. The people are few in number, and they need all hands on deck to grow food and to feed themselves and to pay their debts, which means that it is an economic disadvantage to live within the walls of Jerusalem instead of out in the countryside. Instead of the land producing an overabundance of food and wealth, it's hard work living in and around Jerusalem, putting pressure on Sabbath worship, temple taxes, and community relationships. So by the end of the book, Nehemiah's great achievements are already being undermined by kind of slackness and concessions to sin. So as we reflect on this situation a little more, we would also do well to be sensitive to the creeping nature of compromise. How often might we make exceptions to God's commands because of some special circumstances we've identified? I wonder if we tolerate sin, if we fail to act, and slowly but surely our relationship with God has shifted before we've noticed. As you spend time with God today, is this something that you will ponder with him together? Nehemiah's experience also shows us that compromise happens at a community level as well as at an individual level. When one of us chooses to turn a blind eye to sin in our own lives or for those for whom we have a responsibility, that very often has an impact on others in our church. There's a saying in the armed forces which goes like this: the standard that you walk past is the standard you accept. Or more colloquially, whatever behaviour we decide to turn a blind eye to we are actually complicit in that behaviour. Compromises with sin are subtle at first, but the long-term results can be devastating. So how can we protect our souls from the insidious sin of compromise? Building walls and doing temple sacrifices properly did not guarantee the godliness of Jerusalem in Nehemiah's day. Stricter laws and higher fences don't change our hearts either. Instead, this is the work of God which we invite. We ask God for His Spirit to do that work. We begin with confession, and then we align our will with His. Instead of subverting God's plan from within, we foster that work by making choices and shaping our behaviours which align us with God and His ways. We cultivate an inner life that matches the outward life we want. This excerpt from Psalm 51, I think, is a great place to start. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise.